either in summary form or in provisional form. So we are getting familiar with their formats and becoming familiar with the issues, and we are corresponding with the departments as to how progress is being made and so on. So we are understanding a lot more about the purpose and function of the principles that they were based on and so forth. But of course, we're also keeping a very watchful eye, and indeed playing an active part as individuals on the internal market bill. So much of our questioning this morning will be about how you see the relationship between the frameworks and the internal market bill and the future, of course, for all the frameworks in the context of the dialogue that's presently going on. So it's a particularly timely opportunity for us to hear from you this morning. So what I will do, we have some apologies, which I will just mention now. We unfortunately do not have Lord McGuinness with us this morning, and Lady Randerson and Lord Kane will be leaving us a little early. But apart from that, we are all here, and I think I can just kick off at that point with what I think for you will be a very predictable question, but it lays the framework for us to then probe in more detail as we go forward this morning. You have been working, the three of you, on the frameworks for some time, and you really are genuinely expert in this field. And could you just tell me, each of you, in starting with Nicola, and then Katy and Joe, just tell me how important you think the common frameworks are as a way forward for the internal market and for the harmony of the UK, not least. And what would a successful common framework program have to encompass? What are its strengths and weaknesses, basically? So, Nicola, would you mind starting?
Yes, I mean, I think all of the administrations of the UK acknowledged that Brexit and the repatriation of competences created some challenges for our system of devolution. We're used to a system that has or that appears to have a relatively clear separation between areas that are reserved and areas that are devolved. Personally, I think that was always somewhat exaggerated. There have always been interdependencies, but Brexit and the repatriation of competences certainly increases that. So there was recognition of the need to have some ability to coordinate, to communicate, to cooperate, and perhaps to replace the regulatory frameworks at the EU level with some form of framework at the UK or GB level. We'll come to Northern Ireland later. But I think probably for me, the most important aspect of the frameworks programme has been the process. It's about a process of bringing the different administrations around the table, of recognising the complexities that devolution, that multi-level government presents to the way that the UK is governed. And it's been a process that has revealed what is possible in terms of joint working, even when you have parties with very different ideological outlooks, very different constitutional outlooks. These things have not prevented them from working collaboratively together to set up a system which could offer a way of joint working into the future based on more collaboration than we have had of late in the system. Now, I say it could do that, but I think that is not guaranteed, certainly not even within the frameworks themselves, because it would require perhaps a change of culture at ministerial level to permit that kind of collaborative working on an ongoing basis, but also is clearly threatened by the internal market legislation. What would a successful programme look like? A successful programme would be given an opportunity to work. It would be given the space to see if this approach that has been in the works for some time now, that has involved an awful lot of effort on all sides, if it could work without the need for the sort of rather more heavy-handed and broad brush legislative approach that we are seeing. The frameworks are very specific, they're very targeted, they're very focused, but for me it's ultimately about the process, about a process that is co-owned and one that is based principally on consent.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Katy.
Yes, and thank you very much for allowing me to give evidence before you this morning. So in terms of the importance of the common frameworks, just building on what Nicola says, there's the importance in terms of the task and the challenge that they're trying to meet, and then the importance in terms of the principles and the process by which they are operating. So in terms of the task, there was that mapping exercise which recognised quite how significant the EU had been for the operation of the UK internal market as we've come to know it, and the allowance of the divergence that exists within the UK, allowing policies that recognise the unique interests of the territories of the UK, and yet within the basket of the EU, these were perfectly manageable. So we've had that mapping exercise recognising the significance of leaving the EU for devolution and for the UK itself, and the specific nature of the common frameworks themselves is something that sort of shows there's not necessarily a need to legislate in every single area. So in some areas we're dealing with very, very significant areas of regulation, organ transplantation, food safety, etc. And in others, it's quite clear that actually the way that things operate at the moment, they can continue to do so. There's no need for intervention. So we have a very serious task in many ways, and one I'm very conscious of this fact. What this task is becoming increasingly complicated and affected by the development of the EU in its relationship with, the development of the UK in its relationship with the EU, and the development of the UK in its relationship with other countries in the future. So the task is very significant that the common framework seeks to address. And then in terms of the principles, in many ways, the common frameworks builds on the experience of EU integration and the learning that we have from that. The fact that devolution, as I say, occurred in the context of European integration, and also based on the principle that we saw very much in the EU, which is that of subsidiarity. So only acting where necessary and at the lowest level as is necessary. Those are really important principles. And in terms of a successful common frameworks, I'm reminded of the fact a civil servant said to me, the fact that people are now interested in this is a concern. You know, this kind of process is something that the kind of grimy work of civil servants that very few people are generally interested in. And the fact that it's getting a lot of attention, it makes them feel a little bit uncomfortable. And I think there's a certain wisdom to that in many ways. So a successful common frameworks process is probably one that doesn't generate many headlines. One that is properly scrutinized, of course, and also one that isn't rushed. I would really underline Nicola's point about allowing time for this process to really find its feet, become embedded and become habit, if you like. I'm conscious that the process for developing these common frameworks is somewhat rushed. There's a pressure now on, I think, to have most of these, the priority ones done by the end of this year. And in the context in which we're operating, not least, of course, with COVID-19, it seems an unnecessary pressure and really risks just inadequate fulfillment of the tasks that these common frameworks are trying to address.
Thank you very much indeed. And Jo.
Thank you, Baroness Andrews. And just in terms of identifying the various ways in which the common frameworks are important, as being said, both in terms of the purpose they serve, but also the process and what that reflects. As has been said, we needed to find a way to transition out of EU membership and to find a way of effectively engaging in shared governance. And so what we have with the common frameworks are they're not outputs in themselves, they are governance mechanisms. They're systems of good governance, and that we'll come back to, no doubt, when we talk about scrutiny, the problems that creates, that we're not looking at finished products, we're looking at sort of vehicles by which decisions are made. So they are, they're an essential sort of segue out of the processes of being part of the European Union and those shared governance structures, and we've heard reference to principles like subsidiarity that play through those structures, and finding new ways of undertaking governance in the UK. But as also been said, they're critically important in terms of what they say about how devolution is understood and the respect that they show to the devolution settlements and to the devolved legislatures and governments. And I think it's important as well that we don't forget what these were presented as an alternative to. If we think back to the Withdrawal Act in 2018, the initial form of that act had seen a whole sort of re-centralisation of powers that had been held at EU level. And then there was the approach of, well, there'd be powers to reserve if there was any concern that there might be divergence. And then the common frameworks come through as a more collaborative, cooperative approach. And so it reflects an approach to devolution that is sort of respectful of those settlements, I think. In terms of what a successful system would look like, I think, what we've seen is how things can work incredibly positively. They are demonstrations of effective intergovernmental relations. Now, should they be constrained and limited to these specific pieces of EU legislation that have been rolled over, sort of retained EU law, or should they have a more dynamic existence? And so being able to bring in new areas, that these principles shouldn't simply apply to that rolled over retained EU law, but that they should have a more dynamic forward-looking future. And of course, a successful frameworks programme wouldn't be coming up against this internal market bill in this form at this time, given the impact that the bill might have on those frameworks.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Each of you has touched on aspects of what we have picked up on ourselves, and you've done so in a very clear and resonant way. And particularly, I think what Nicola said, and you've all said in different ways, in fact, that these frameworks have to be allowed to work. And that takes us nicely, I think, into Lord Bruce's question now, which he's, I think, going to pursue that idea. Lord Bruce?
Thank you, and thank you all three for both your submissions and for being here. I mean, the Common Frameworks approach has been going for 3 years, and most people who've been involved in it seem to think it's working in a positive way. The question is, suddenly we've got the UK Internal Market Bill, which seems to cut right across. Do you think the bill is necessary, or do you think the Common Frameworks, suitably adapted, could actually deal with whatever issues there are, including possible need for ad hoc legislation rather than a catch-all bill? And in the context of the way the bill has been going and the reaction of committees and the devolved administrations, what's your take on how the government are reacting to this? I mean, the Prime Minister has just been reported as saying that devolution was a disaster and Tony Blair's biggest mistake, which is a wonderful way to launch the Conservative campaign for the Scottish elections, I have to say, next May. But the question arises from that is, do you think the government have got any real understanding of frankly, the anger at the reaction and the fact that at the moment they don't seem to have persuaded people that we need this and that the Common Frameworks are actually strong enough to carry the burden?
Nicola, would you like to kick off first? And I think that each of you actually briefly ought to have a go at that question before we get on to more detailed ones, because it is so fundamental.
Just on the necessity or otherwise of the bill, I mean, the UK Internal Market Bill and the frameworks process are trying to do different things for a similar problem. In that the frameworks are very specific. They are very focused on particular issues, on particular areas of regulation, and so they're tailored to that. They have that extensive engagement between the governments. They have joint consultation with stakeholders, which in itself is quite interesting. So it's a worked through process for a specific area of policy, whereas obviously the UK Internal Market Bill is a much more sweeping approach. I'm not personally convinced of the need for this UK internal market legislation, but that doesn't necessarily mean there wouldn't be a case for some sort of rules-based system that might underpin the frameworks process. Not this one, but it might be that there is a case for some sort of general rules-based approach, but we don't know yet. And I think that the more effective option, the option I would have preferred to see would be one that allowed the frameworks to work, or not work, to explore them, to see where and whether there are any gaps that need to be filled. I think the perceived problem that the UK Internal Market Bill is intended to address, there's not an awful lot of evidence that it exists. We already have a very tightly integrated market. There isn't a whole lot of evidence about barriers to trade that would emerge in the absence of this legislation. So it's not clear to me that there is a case that has been made for this bill. Once, after the frameworks have been allowed to work, it may be that there are some gaps, but do you fill those with an all-encompassing constraint effectively on what devolution can achieve and what the reach of the devolved institutions within their own territories? Or do you fill those gaps with other frameworks? They may be legislative frameworks that are equally focused and tailor-made to address the specific problem, or non-legislative frameworks for that matter. It seems to me that something, and again, I go back to the process point, something that builds in a pre-legislative negotiation and consultation and cooperation between the administrations is absolutely vital. And there is nothing like that in the UK Internal Market Bill approach. And indeed, it looks set to be passed, if indeed that is the end result of this process, in the face of opposition from the devolved institutions. And that in itself is in some ways quite a remarkable, not the first time, but it's the first time that that would have happened in a piece of legislation that is specifically designed to alter the reach of the devolved institutions.
Thank you, Nicola. Jo, would you like to add briefly to this from the Welsh perspective?
Well, from a general perspective, I just want to draw parallels. The point is made that we already have a very integrated market in the United Kingdom, and that has worked through the decades of devolution that have taken place within EU membership, and EU law has had a significant role to play in sort of ensuring that there is that free movement. Now, what we see with, do we need the bill? We don't, as Nicola says, we don't need this bill in this form at this time. I think at most, we could perhaps make a case for a continuation of some form of horizontal free movement principle, as we've experienced as part of the European Union, that the common frameworks themselves are in those areas where we've had harmonizing legislation from the EU. Now, that doesn't cover everything. It covers an increasing, it has increased over the decades in terms of what it does cover, but there are some areas where rather than those pieces of legislation applying, you've got the horizontal principle of free movement that applies. So that's missing in the UK system. But what the bill does is sort of impose a supercharged version of that, and hasn't made the case for why the principle that we used to experiencing under the EU context, with the various grounds for justification, anchoring in sort of ideals of subsidiarity, why isn't that a starting point? And if that seemed to be in some way insufficient, then we can move from there. But rather than sort of remaking things in this sort of very radical top-down way that the bill does, that I think that case hasn't been made.
Fine, thank you very much indeed. And Katy.
Yes, so from the Northern Ireland perspective, it's probably worth remembering, if you look at what the Cabinet Office issued in July 2019 on an update on the frameworks process. And it was talking about the principles of sort of increasing transparency and setting out the engagement strategy, and also noting, of course, that internal market required was, it was cross-cutting issues and required a shared approach. And we've obviously seen a very different conception of it this year. What we had in 2019 was the possibility of the backstop, sort of gone by July, but that idea that whatever, recognizing that Northern Ireland would be aligned with the EU for certain areas of regulation, that GB would be aligned too, that it would follow on and avoid any frictions and fissures in the UK as a result of that. So we've had something very different in 2020. And the protocol, of course, puts Northern Ireland in a distinct position. And without going into the detail of that just yet, there are concerns in Northern Ireland regarding market access and other aspects that the UK Internal Market Bill tries to develop that aren't covered by the Common Frameworks process, and that arise very much as a result of the protocol. And so there are two things there. The one is about Northern Ireland goods being sold in GB and having unfettered access to GB. And then the other concern, of course, is GB goods entering Northern Ireland. So the UK Internal Market Bill can't address or doesn't address goods moving from GB into NI, but it does address goods moving the other way. We don't have the unfettered access clause in there at the moment in the current version of the bill. But with regards to market access, this is a general concern from Northern Ireland business, and as I say, it does go beyond that of that is covered by the Common Frameworks. And now the question is this a way to go about it? Obviously, the UK Internal Market Bill, as Nicola and Joe have said, it deals with it in a completely different way to the Common Frameworks principles. And you heard that last week in the evidence you received last week. And that in and of itself places great pressure on the assumptions behind devolution and the functioning of devolution. And it is worth noting just how important devolution is for the operation of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. And I think any statements being made by the government in relation to devolution should always bear that in mind. It's not just about the SNP, for example, it's about the peace process here as well.
Indeed. Nicola, we have a question on Northern Ireland a little later on, but I'm just going to ask, since you've already touched on it, and I know Lord Kane is pressed for time. Jonathan, would you like to come in with your question now? Would that be helpful?
Yeah, very, very grateful to you, Lord Chairman. It's really following on from that, Katy, and forgive me, some colleagues will have heard me raise this subject before, but I've never really had a satisfactory answer to it. I mean, Northern Ireland, as you made clear, is part of the UK customs territory. It's part of the UK internal market, and it's part of the Common Frameworks process. But for a lot of the issues that are covered by the frameworks, it remains, to all intents and purposes, part of the European Union, with its rules not made in Westminster or Stormont, but in Brussels. And that opens up, obviously, the potential for significant divergence. So we end up with common frameworks for Great Britain, but Northern Ireland operating, separate regimes. What I've not got my head round and not had a satisfactory answer to is what happens in circumstances where the Commission proposes changes to the rules of the single market. Who speaks for Northern Ireland, given that the UK is outside of the EU? Now, there might be some who would step forward and say, well, perhaps Mr. Coveney could, intervene on Northern Ireland's behalf. And while some, I'm not looking at Margaret in particular, but while some might find that reasonably satisfactory, there would be others in Northern Ireland who would vehemently oppose such a move. So who actually represents the interests of Northern Ireland in shaping EU rules to which it will be subject?
I'm happy to answer that. At the moment, there is. So I wrote a report with Professor David Finnemore and Dr. Lena Komarova on post-Brexit governance challenges for Northern Ireland, and this is a fundamental point. So there's dynamic alignment in the protocol, and this is relevant to the Common Frameworks process as well. Dynamic alignment for Northern Ireland to EU rules. So this means that the annex in the protocol that includes the technical regulations, etc., that Northern Ireland has to follow, that if those are amended or replaced, then those are automatically applying in Northern Ireland. The question of scrutiny of that is a valid one and a live one. We don't know how that will happen. If the EU expands regulation in areas that are also relevant to the protocol, we don't know how relevancy to the protocol will be interpreted. Then it will raise this with the Joint Consultative Working Group that hasn't been established yet, and then it will go to the Joint Committee for a decision. So there, at that point, you have the UK input. How will the UK's input be affected by concerns and issues and realities in Northern Ireland? That is a live issue that hasn't been addressed yet. If we don't have agreement at the Joint Committee level, so if the UK and the EU cannot agree about the expansion of the protocol, then there's a possibility of the EU taking action to fill the gaps. So this, I mean, and then the Lord's EU Select Committee has covered this in some detail. Just that very live possibility of the dynamic expanding nature of the protocol and the inability of legislation and scrutiny in the UK system as it is to keep up with that and to respond to that challenge.
Thank you.
Sorry, sorry, just follow up. So I take it from that we are right to be concerned about this particular issue. Could I just follow up with one final question, please, if I may, and that is that the Internal Market Bill has been characterised by some, not all, but by some, as a threat to the Belfast/Good Friday Agreement. Again, to Professor Hayward, would you agree with that assessment, and if so, why?
I think fundamentally, it's important to recognise that the Internal Market Bill doesn't meet the concerns of Northern Ireland. So I mentioned market access and unfettered access. The Internal Market Bill doesn't address those. Partly because we don't have any minimum standards, so we don't have a commitment from GB to follow those standards as they would relate to Northern Ireland, and partly because, as I mentioned before, it doesn't address the question of GB goods moving into NI. But more fundamentally, there is a concern that the explicit statement to break international law, the capacity to break international law, undermines the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, and so too does the elements of that bill.
Sorry, sorry to interrupt. Could you just be quite specific on that? Which bit of the Belfast Agreement is threatened by what Brandon Lewis said in the House of Commons about international law?
So the Good Friday Belfast Agreement is international agreement, and the situation in which the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland says that the UK government is legislating to break international law poses grave dangers to the fundamental principles of of basically the UK standing as a guarantor of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. It goes right to the heart of questions of responsibility and of trust, and I think, you know, and I'm sorry, and more than that, the fact that the government amendments to the Internal Market Bill sort of double down on that, setting aside the possibility of human rights legislation as being of any relevance to that, or putting hindrance on that capacity to break international law. So this, if the Internal Market Bill had done anything to really address concerns about where the protocol leaves Northern Ireland in relation to those matters you and I were just responding to your question on, then it would be different, but it doesn't. And so there are areas of obviously democratic accountability, transparency, scrutiny, a voice for Northern Ireland, representation. All of these things can be addressed, but the UK Internal Market Bill doesn't address those.
Thanks for that. I could probably pursue this for at least the next half hour, but I better let others have a go. Thanks very much.
Can I share a dilemma with the committee? Nicola wants to comment on that, and Margaret, your question is in Northern Ireland, but Lady Randerson has to leave early. Actually,
it's all right. It's all right, Chair. I'm not leaving till 12.
Oh, I beg your pardon.
Yeah.
So in that case, Margaret, would you like to come in on this, since we're now dealing with Northern Ireland, and we might as well actually have the complete conversation? And then Nicola, if I can bring you in at the end, is that okay? Fine.
Thank you. Thank you. And could I declare my interest as according to the registered members' interests, because I am a member of the board of Cooperation Ireland. So I think I do need to declare that. In dealing with the Northern Ireland Protocol, where is the interaction between the Northern Ireland Protocol and the common frameworks?
Nicola, sorry, I beg your pardon. Katie, would you mind taking the conversation forward, and then I'll bring in Nicola?
Yes. So, so as you're well aware, so the areas that intersect with Northern Ireland devolved competence are more than any other regional nation of the UK. And this means that both the categories 2 and 3 of the common frameworks are ones that have more affecting Northern Ireland than elsewhere in the UK. But it's also true that the protocol covers areas that have been identified in the frameworks process as not requiring further action. And these are quite significant areas, for example, covering PPE, tobacco advertising, clinical trials. So it's not as if those areas that were assessed before as not requiring further action aren't affected too by the protocol. So potentially dynamic alignment. And this relates to Professor Hunt and Professor McEwen's point earlier about the need to, the importance of the common frameworks being constantly reviewed and that flexibility that's present in them. So Northern Ireland civil servants have an awfully large task on their plate in being involved in the development of these frameworks that cover 40 areas of important regulation in Northern Ireland. Also bearing in mind, a lot of that will be affected by negotiations at the UK-EU level, not least relating to the protocol and the implementation of the protocol.
And could I ask a supplementary?
Yes, of course.
Chair, in your opinion, Professor Hayward, do you think that ministers, and particularly in the office of the First and Deputy First, are charged with the import of the Northern Ireland Protocol and also the common frameworks, and has enough work been done on them?
The Northern Ireland Executive has approved the principles of the common frameworks, but bear in mind we are behind the curve somewhat. So we have a double whammy of not having had an executive during the early years of the development of the common frameworks. And although civil servants were attending, and also the existence of the protocol, which means that we are very directly affected by the UK-EU relationship, the decisions of the Joint Committee, and the ongoing implementation of the protocol. So we have all of that going on, plus we have some lack of clarity still about the areas of competence that are affected by the protocol. So in some ways, they're clearly reserved, and I should have mentioned that, sorry, but areas that are identified as being reserved competence under the Common Frameworks process, such as state aid, are now covered by the protocol as well. So we have, we have a lack of clarity about who's responsible for different parts of the agreement and implementing the withdrawal agreement and the protocol, and that has yet to be clarified, and that then has a knock-on effect for the Common Frameworks process itself.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can I just ask Nicola to comment briefly, because I think you were hoping to.
Yes, I just wanted to return to the founding principles of the common frameworks, because first of all, they do include the specific needs of Northern Ireland and the specific circumstances of Northern Ireland as being incorporated into the frameworks programme, but also the principle of divergence is perceived certainly by the Scottish and Welsh governments as a very important part of the frameworks approach. So I just wanted to reinforce that common frameworks do not mean uniform frameworks. There is a deliberate intention on the part, certainly of the devolved governments, but given that it's been a joint programme recognised by all, that they should allow for sufficient flexibility and elasticity to enable and facilitate divergence within them. And that's required in the case of Northern Ireland because of the conditions of the protocol. But through political choice, it's also the case for the Scottish Government too, who are currently going through a legislative process of their own to institutionalise a keeping pace provision to enable them to keep pace with EU law where they choose to do so. So there is an expectation that the frameworks would be sufficiently broad to allow for that kind of divergence, and I just wanted to reinforce that point.
And that's very useful at that point, Nicola, because I think our next group of questions touch on divergence in different ways. So can I ask Lady Randerson to take her question?
Thank you very much, Chair. And before I ask a question, I must declare an interest. I'm very proud to say that I'm Chancellor of Cardiff University, where, of course, Joe Hunt works. I have been listening with great care to what's been said about the potential for gaps in common frameworks, that they are not a whole solution, that there might well be a need for an internal market bill, but just not this one, not expressed as it is here. And I'd be very grateful if our witnesses could please address what potential gaps there are. Could they say more about the aspects of maintaining an internal market that the common frameworks won't address?
Joe, I wonder whether you could take that question, and Katy and Nicola, if you feel there's something you must add to that, otherwise we can go on to the next one after this. So Joe, what would you say to that?
Okay, thank you. I think we recognise that the common frameworks are, as we said, they're a means of managing policy divergence. And if we take them as that, then we recognise that we'll have a situation where the regulations may be different across different parts of the UK. And if we allow that to operate, then that means that we might have hindrances to free movement, using sort of the EU terminology. If we've got different different regulatory regimes. Under an EU context, if there's been space for that, has been allowed in the legislation, then that space is there. That space for divergence is there. I think what we have to do is accept that if we allow this divergence, if we understand that that's part and parcel of devolution, that those differences may exist. So we're not to expect uniformity, and so there's that to bear in mind with this process. The other the limitations that are potentially limitations, of course, that the common frameworks, as we mentioned before, are in those areas where there is existing retained EU law, and what we don't know yet is that if there are new areas that emerge, some of that harmonising law is only partially harmonising, that they may still have areas within that aren't fully harmonised. And even with this nutritional labelling, there are sort of specific elements that are not necessarily fully covered under EU legislation, and Article 34, free movement article, still needs to sort of operate over the top of that within an EU context. But we don't yet know where those gaps are going to emerge, if they're going to emerge, and if they're going to be a concern and have an impact on the market. I think at some point, if we can understand a bit better how the internal market bill works alongside what we have in the common frameworks. I think we went into this process perhaps expecting that where there was an agreement to diverge, that would then be respected across the UK, and the consequences that came from that for trade within the UK were accepted, and that there would be, one part of the UK would not have to accept products from another part of the UK because if there had been an agreement to diverge under the common frameworks. But what we look like we might be getting under the internal market bill is that even cuts across any agreed divergence, that there may be differences on nutritional compositional standards or on labelling that might be accepted and agreed under the frameworks, but that those rules will only apply to the local market and to producers within that local market. And then the market access principles may still apply to achieve the internal market objectives. And I think we're not yet clear on that. There's a sort of suggestive that's how this is potentially going to work, and I think that's very concerning from the common frameworks perspective.
Katy and Nicola, would you want to add anything to that, or could we move on? No, I think we can develop the argument with the next question, actually, Lord Garnier.
Thank you very much. I think what I've learned from the conversation that we've been having this morning is that the United Kingdom Internal Market Bill is probably designed to answer a political question and not a legal or a constitutional question. What that question is, I don't know, but certainly the instruments that we're looking at are divergent, and they're pulling in different directions. The common framework system and the internal market bill seem to be pulling in different directions. Now, I suppose that's a function of our constitutional history, and we just have to get used to that. As academics, I guess you're looking for something closer to precision and exactitude, whereas politicians tend to fudge things and are untidy and messy. And here we have this in spades. We have the most wonderful constitutional mess up. And there doesn't seem to be a legal instrument which is helping us. Do you agree with me that the bill and the common framework system, they're both pulling in different directions, and therefore the bill limits the ability of the framework system to promote or to facilitate sensible divergence? We've got the obvious case of Northern Ireland straddling the United Kingdom and the European Union. But how do you think we solve this constitutionally or legally? forget the politics because you're not politicians. But how do you think we design instruments to cope with this? And can you think of any specific examples where this problem is highlighted in a particularly stark form?
Nicola, would you like to take that on?
Yes, I agree with Lord Gani that these are pulling in very different directions, absolutely, without question. I think it probably speaks to a bigger issue, which is the recognition and acknowledgement that devolution didn't just change Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, devolution changed the United Kingdom. And the Frameworks programme was, and indeed what we've seen with COVID actually, was beginning to move us to a way of working that recognises the distinctive roles of each of the administrations within their areas of competence. And it talks to one of the weaknesses that has been a hallmark of the system of devolution in the UK from the outset is the weakness of the intergovernmental infrastructure and the processes for facilitating coordination, cooperation, and where appropriate co-decision between the different institutions. That's really been a major problem for the UK, and it is made more apparent by the challenges of Brexit, the current context, by the challenges of the pandemic. And I think it does really matter that that is addressed. And the Frameworks programme was a way to do that, was in addition to the specific details and content of the individual frameworks, it was part of a broader process that suggested a different way of working, a different practice, if you like, that isn't constitutional necessarily. You might have constitutional underpinning for intergovernmental relations in the future, but we don't have that at the moment. But it is suggesting a different working culture. And what you tend to see in other countries that have federal systems or multi-level systems of a non-federal kind is recognition that you need to work at it. You need to work at it on an ongoing basis. You need to have the institutionalized relationships between the different equally legitimate areas of equally legitimate governments from the different constituent parts. The Internal Market Bill seems to want to counteract the effect of devolution. So it doesn't necessarily limit the ability, at least not directly limit the ability of the devolved institutions to pass laws as they see fit, but it limits their ability for those laws to make a difference because it limits their reach, it limits their scope. They're no longer laws that they can apply throughout the territory. They're only laws in this case, in the areas that are covered by the bill, that would apply to local producers or local service providers. So it's a very different approach between the two. And yes, they are pulling in very different directions.
I think that's a very clear explanation of the differences in relation to how we see devolved power working, should we say. Very helpful indeed. David, Lord Hope, would you like to take your question on?
Yes, thank you very much. I think you made it clear at the very beginning how uneasy you all are about the bill. But the fact is we have the bill and it's been passed through the Commons. It's received a second reading in the House of Lords. And my concern has been to see how we can amend it to try to make the two systems work side by side. I was particularly interested in Joe's point that the bill cuts across any agreed divergence. And that's precisely the point that I picked up in an amendment, which will be debated and probably voted on tomorrow, which, if I can just say it fairly slowly so you can pick it up, says that the principles, market access principles, shall not apply to any provision that gives effect to a decision to diverge from harmonized rules that has been agreed through the common frameworks process. Now, I think that touches on Joe's point, and the question really is, will that help the common frameworks process to continue as we would all like it to do, And a supplementary question is, could you give examples of divergence so that I can have in mind the kind of things where this provision would be really useful? Could I ask in sequence to comment on that, and perhaps start with Joe and then come to Nicola and then on to Katy?
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. There's the necessity to take the Common Frameworks process out of scope, the Internal Market Bill. Just to go back, of those common frameworks that we've seen in some sort of incipient state, the food and feed safety, I think there was a report to the FSA that clearly suggests that the outcomes of the process are going to be within scope. And in the documents, it should be noted the application of mutual recognition could result in ministers having to accept food and feed products on the market that the FSA had advised as being unsafe if ministers in other parts of the UK had taken different decisions. So recognising that even if there is an achieved outcome, that unless that is coming together and creating a common outcome, then the bill will sort of cut in. So it's both, we need to make sure that the outcomes of that process are protected to make it worthwhile engaging in this process. But I wonder if, stepping back, perhaps we need to protect more than the outcomes, and give that space for the process more generally. And the opportunity to work through those processes. And if they are identified as common framework areas, that they should be sort of held back from action in those fields. And I think just looking to the future as well, whether there's a case sort of prospectively to bring things and within the common frameworks process and to protect them. At some point, a decision to be made about whether the common framework process is going to be limited simply to how we deal with retained EU law, or whether it's more forward-looking and more dynamic, and in which case then, the relationship, what the purpose of the bill is, and the provisions of the bill, and when they kick in, that we need to make decisions around when that happens, and what else has to happen first, or the opportunity to happen first, intergovernmentally or interparliamentarily, before the operation of the bill.
Thank you.
Yes, would you like to carry on? Sorry, David.
Yes, I read the amendment and would absolutely support it. I suppose the only concern I have, and it's not specific to the amendment, it's more about the broader unrolling of the frameworks programme, is whether it is seen as a finite exercise linked specifically to what started as a very long list of EU regulations, which has, most of which, by the way, the conclusion of the frameworks programme has been that they don't require any common framework at all. And then there are the 20 or so, 22 I think it is, that are deemed to be suitable for a non-legislative framework. I'm not sure if the amendment would bring those, would apply to those as well. And then you have the specific ones that are targeted for some sort of legislative underpinning, which doesn't appear for the most part to be about primary legislation, but nonetheless those would be within scope. But I think what we are hoping for and trying to encourage is a longer term process that captures the way of working of the frameworks programme, that goes beyond this particular exercise of that particular list. The frameworks that are agreed will in any case be living, breathing frameworks. They have to be. They're as much about process as they are about the content of anything that is agreed, but they will have to be responsive to other developments, to experiences, to things that unfold. So if that could be protected within the legislation, I think that would also be a positive. And as Joe said, if there is space for other issues that may arise that we haven't yet foreseen that can be brought within the scope of a broader frameworks programme that goes beyond that initial exercise, then I think that would be a way to protect frameworks within the content of the bill itself. But I think for us, there are, the three of us were part of a co-authored report that we'd be happy to send to the committee that was specific to the bill. And in that report, we did recommend a number of changes that could help to improve the bill, including some form of pre-legislative negotiation, something that embeds the joint working that has been the positive of the frameworks programme in the process of maintaining and supporting a UK internal market as well. And that's what's missing from the bill as it stands. But certainly I think the amendment is an improvement for sure.
Thank you.
Katy, do you want to add anything very briefly to that? Because time is getting on a little.
Yes, very briefly. I think we're struggling with the fact that obviously Common Frameworks is quite an innovative process, and we're not really sure, when we think about what they look like, they'll be different depending on the departments involved and the particular subject. And I'm conscious this is the difficulty that we have then in trying to, or that you have, in trying to legislate to address this and accommodate this in the internal market bill, because as we've often repeated, the internal market bill claims it's trying to give certainty and avoid the nuance in many ways. It's very much a heavy-handed approach to a challenge, whereas the Common Frameworks is a much more of a nuanced and innovative approach, and therefore trying to bring them together is extremely difficult. And given that that it is that each of them, even if we do have a legislative outcome, it's still about the process by which you have continual negotiation between the four. Even where Northern Ireland is following EU rules, they've still got that relationship formalised. And this is why it's, I just sort of wanted to mention that this is a difficulty that you have, I think.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Can we move on to Lord Murphy and Lord Fuchs now? Lord Murphy?
Thank you very much indeed. You touched a little bit on this over the last half hour or so, which is the relationship between the common frameworks generally, highly technical in many ways, and how that affects the devolution settlement. I'd like to be specific, though, in the sense of affecting the spirit of the devolution settlement. Lord Kane, for example, mentioned earlier about the Good Friday Agreement and the common frameworks. But it isn't necessarily just the letter of the law. It's the spirit, in this case, of the Good Friday Agreement and the spirit of the devolution settlement. And to illustrate that, in terms of redistributing what would have been European structural funding to Wales, for example, to build a relief road around Newport and the M4, highly controversial. I personally support it. But if the government, the UK government, decided to do that and use the money which would have gone to the devolved administration, that seems to me to go against the spirit of the devolution settlement. So despite my personal view that I think the relief road should be built, I believe it's important that the Welsh government, because it is devolved, takes the decision on that. And then just one sort of much smaller point regarding the process. And at the moment, the devolved governments relate to the specific departmental Secretary of State and Department. And do our witnesses think there is a role for the territorial Secretaries of State and their departments in trying to ease the problems and tensions that inevitably will emerge from implementing this policy?
Joe, would you like to kick off with that one? Joe?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, coming, sorry. Just to pick up on the first of those points around the impact that the common frameworks have on the devolution settlements, and to reflect that in terms of how many impact they might have on the the distribution and exercise of competence, that, you know, they don't re-centralize any of that competence. They give a space for the exercise of those competences, but recognizing the sort of the shared interests of the UK as a whole to have a system where those competences can be exercised collaboratively and cooperatively. And I think to pick up the idea that Lord Murphy you had there about the spirit. I mean, there's a technical impact on legislation which the common frameworks, you know, doesn't touch the competence, whereas of course the internal market bill does, and explicitly takes some things into sort of reserved competence, or has the potential to cut across the effectiveness of how competence operates. But as you say, it's very much in keeping with a spirit of respect for the devolution settlements and for the devolved legislatures and governments, and that, again, the internal market bill starts from a different place.
Nicola, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, I agree. I mean, if you go back to the founding principles again of the frameworks, they explicitly respect the devolution settlements and respect the spirit of the devolution settlements. The UK Internal Market Bill does not. Perhaps I'll pick up on the question of the role of the territorial offices. I think we are some ways away from those offices being able to play a mediating role. If, as I've seen suggested, the management of the financial powers, the successor to structural funds, is managed through the territorial offices instead of through the devolved governments, as was the case before. I don't know if that will be the case. I think that would be seen as quite a provocative move, and the territorial offices tend to be in the role more of representing the UK government in the devolved territories, rather than facilitating communication between the devolved institutions and the UK government. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. That is a perfectly reasonable role, but if it has to be seen in that context, I think, with proposals around the use of the financial powers. The financial powers aspect of the UK Internal Market Bill, it does seem to challenge, it's not entirely clear how it will interact with the system of territorial finance that we have, but it does seem at least to be possibly a way to get around some of the decisions that have been taken by the devolved institutions. In the example that you gave around the M4 Relief Road, that would appear to be the case. However, it will come upon limits, because there are other aspects of the devolution settlements that would come into play in spending decisions around some big infrastructure project of that kind, planning, for example, or other areas of environmental control that are within the devolution settlements, would have to be part of any big infrastructure decisions. So it does again push us towards the need to have more effective systems and processes that facilitate governments working together, rather than trying to find routes to bypass the need to do so.
Thank you. George, can we go straight into your question?
Thanks very much, Chair. Can I thank the witnesses for explaining so well the difficulties and the complications of our incomplete devolution system that we have, our unbalanced system that we have at the moment. And would they agree, can I pick up what Edward Garnier said, would they agree that part of this, a major part of this, is because the UK government is having to speak for England and for the United Kingdom, and that creates some conflict. And now, I would hope, and I think there are others, and there's a move in this direction, that we'll have a completion of our devolution settlement, and we'll see some devolution, some form of devolution in England. But meantime, would it be possible through the review of the, and how would you suggest it might be possible through the review of the intergovernmental structures, the intergovernmental relations structures, to deal with this and to try and help this and to try and cope with this conflict and this difficulty that the UK government have. I think it would be helpful if you could spell out exactly how you think that might work.
Could I ask Nicola to have a go at that first, because of the slightly more complex relationship with Northern Ireland? Yeah.
Again, we fed in some proposals to the review along these lines. I mean, there is no way to get around the asymmetry that would be involved, even if you had devolution in England. There is no way to get around some of the asymmetries involved when one of the nations of the UK is so much larger, so much more influential economically than the others. That would be a feature of the UK anyway, regardless. I'm also slightly wary of a policy approach that would push devolution for England because of the effects that it has, that its absence has for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. I think there is a need to explore more deeply precisely how the people of England would like to be governed, and that has to be at the fore of addressing that particular question. In relation to intergovernmental relations, I think it's been very interesting listening to the frustrations of Andy Burnham, for example, in relation to COVID, which are so very familiar to anyone who has observed intergovernmental relations between the devolved institutions and the UK government. And it speaks to a broader issue about the need to consult and to communicate and to bring people into the conversations early enough on, so that they can feel that there is an opportunity to genuinely be part of the decision-making process and to influence the policies at the development stage, rather than having to constantly react at the last minute. I don't know what the Intergovernmental Relations Review will do in this area, if indeed we see an outcome of it at all. But there are a number of different things that you might do, including setting up a different forum to enable English regional voices to feed into the process, and that then be represented in the Joint Ministerial Committee or whatever replaces it. It could be that you have a Minister for England that within the UK government. There are various different options, none of which will be perfect, but all of which would be better than what we currently have.
Katy or Joe, would you like to come in? Katy, do you have a view on this?
Sorry, I just think it's a pity that we haven't seen the results of that review, and just noticed yesterday in the policy statements released by Bayes on the internal market, some of us have been led to believe that the Office for the Internal Market would be quite a substantial and significant body for input from the devolved regions and nations, and yet we see in that policy statement that it would just involve an annual ministerial consultation, which seems such a contrast with obviously the approach taken by Common Frameworks and what we understand the relationship should be ideally between the governments. And it's a pity that this review we're expecting at the end of the year, aren't we? It's a pity we haven't seen it before now.
Can I ask, Chair, I wonder if our witnesses got any indication when they gave evidence to the Constitution Committee of Lord Dunlop's thinking, and whether that will feed in to the review and influence the review in any positive way.
Does anyone have any thoughts about that?
Well, so Lord Dunlop's review, as I understand it, was specifically a review for the Prime Minister. It wasn't reported directly to the joint review, as far as I'm aware. So I think that the two are quite distinctive. The review is another one of those examples of cooperative working. Given that we haven't seen anything come out of it, then we can't say whether it's a successful one or not. But it is very much a co-owned process, just like the Frameworks Programme has been a co-owned process. and we haven't, Lord Dunlop's review was completed a long time ago, and we haven't seen the outcomes of it yet, so I'm not sure.
Thank you.
Before we move on to the two last groups of questions, can I ask our witnesses, are you happy to stay for another 10 minutes? Because we will overrun, and I hope that's all right with you. So in that case, Lady Redfern and Lady Crawley.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, and thank you for coming and speaking with us. I have found your responses very interesting, and I do take note on the comments, Nicola, regarding process joint working and how it should look into introduce a more collaborative, possibly culture. And to Katy, highlighted a successful common frameworks process should not be rushed. And Joe commented, process respectful, building a dynamic forward future. So it leads me into my question. How do you see the role of Parliament and the devolved legislatives in scrutinising the common frameworks?
Katy, could I ask you to start in view of the situation in Northern Ireland?
So we're a little bit behind in Northern Ireland. So we don't, at the moment, we don't have a process for standing orders as they do in Scotland and in Wales for scrutinising secondary legislation that arises from the EU withdrawal acts 2018-2020. I think that's worth noting. But then what we have for Northern Ireland with regards to scrutinising the common frameworks, it seems very much a process of learning by doing. I think there's a sense of that it's obviously yet to happen, but there'll be a process by which the committees themselves in the Northern Ireland Assembly will give feedback on the process, which actually isn't a bad thing, I don't think. But it does, as to go back to that earlier point, it does require clarity in terms of the timetable for it. And then the broader question about the relationship between Northern Ireland Assembly and the process in the House of Parliament is also a live issue.
Thank you. That's important for us to know that. Can we have Joe and then Nicola on this?
Yes. I mean, obviously, as we've identified already, the common frameworks themselves are a process, not an outcome. So it's in terms of having that continual engagement with that process, and has been identified. A lot of this is going to be through secondary legislation. Even those areas, the category 3 areas of those areas which require legislative underpinning. And I was just looking at what we've seen so far from the summaries. We've seen, for example, the emissions trading scheme. That's identified as a category 3 area. So we might expect to see some primary legislation. That's sort of the indications we've had so far is that's what we'll see. And so there's at least the opportunity there for parliamentary scrutiny of a different order. But then the ETS itself, it says it's going to be adopted using secondary legislation, and it's using legislation adopted under existing legislation, Climate Change Act, the Finance Act. So it's taking powers in there rather than new primary legislation. So I think we need at each point to sort of reset our understandings of what these things are and how they're going to look like, and the points at which Parliament can engage. We need to keep on our toes with that.
Yes. And Nicola, finally, briefly.
Just very, I mean, I agree with all of that, but just very briefly, I mean, we've been talking a lot about the need for more cooperation and co-decision and treating that as a positive thing. Yeah. It has a downside, and the downside is that it muddies the water somewhat about who's taking decisions over what. And so I think parliamentary scrutiny is absolutely crucial to ensure that governments, each individual government, is held to account for its decisions and its actions in making or breaking common frameworks and the other aspects of intergovernmental relations that may accompany this process. That's a challenge. It's a challenge for all of the committees on an ongoing basis, and I think it's not something that can be dealt with purely by a single committee that has oversight of the whole thing. There may well be a place for that, but also for the individual subject area committees to be mindful of the role of frameworks within their particular policy field. But it's definitely a challenge.
Thank you. Christine?
Yes, thank you very much, Kay. And absolutely fascinating session, and thank you to our guests this morning. Just moving a little bit further with this whole idea of the process being as important in common frameworks as the technical outcome. In the future, how do you see parliamentary scrutiny of frameworks once they've been agreed? And to what extent should this be underpinned by greater interparliamentary cooperation? You've talked just there in answer to Liz's question about some of the ideas you have for future interparliamentary cooperation, but perhaps we can go a little bit into, for instance, the recommendations you've made in your research paper, which all three of you have contributed to, where you say that the start of devolution, from the start of devolution rather, the UK's approach has been underdeveloped and fragile, and that new institutions and practices are urgently needed. And I think it was Nicola that raised that whole point again a few minutes ago about new practices. Is this a cue for common frameworks as they exist in front of us today, or to come centre stage, or do common frameworks have to evolve into something else for that to work?
And Nicola, I think you'd better kick off with that.
I think it's an issue that goes beyond the specific common frameworks. Clearly, there is a role for subject area specialists and specialist committees to examine individual frameworks within their spheres, but they're often very technical and very detailed. And I wonder if committees would enthusiastically engage with each individual framework on that basis. But I think it's part of a broader approach, and it's about having oversight of the kinds of things that are discussed and agreed in an intergovernmental sphere. Now, I noted last week that the UK government made a commitment about increasing transparency in intergovernmental relations, following on from commitments that have already been made by the Scottish and the Welsh governments. And that is an improvement, a little improvement, in that they are now at least publishing and making it easier for us to see the reports from various intergovernmental meetings. But the content of those reports is still extraordinarily limited in that it's very difficult to get a real sense of what's being agreed by whom, where the obstacles are, where the barriers are, where the difficulties are, because so much of that is still behind closed doors. So again, I think it is more about a process issue and oversight of a process, at least as much as it is about oversight of the detail of individual frameworks, if that makes sense. I don't know.
Joe and Katy, is there anything you would like to add to that?
If I may, I think from a governance perspective, we've identified how the common frameworks themselves can be seen in a positive light, but also layering into that the need for effective parliamentary engagement, because in and of themselves, we may have, it is, if we take one individual common framework, which is technical, which is limited, it may not seem as having much of a consequence for devolved competence and the involvement of the parliaments in that. But suddenly, if we stand back and we see the number of them and just what might be happening in what are seen as quite technical areas, but there might be sort of significant policy evolution taking place in those. We don't yet know the sorts of things we're going to be seeing under them. Then I think, you know, we need to ensure that there's that proper interparliamentary or parliamentary engagement in that oversight of that process, because we could end up with a lot that falls within devolved competence operating and taking place within these common frameworks, with very limited role for the devolved legislatures to engage in that.
Yes, thank you. Can we just move on to the last question now? Lord Thomas.
I'm sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. May I first declare an interest, which is relevant? I serve on the first Minister of Wales's advisory committee on the EU, on which Professor Jo Hunt also assists. And it's relevant in the sense that I'm very grateful to her now, what must be more than a year and a half ago, raising the problems of these common frameworks and the need to deal with them urgently. But regretfully, this was not a matter on which the government of the government in England and of the UK was prepared to move or discuss. Can I ask you then this question, which is a narrow one, and it relates to the relationship between common frameworks and international agreements. How do you see them working, and what problems do you envisage? Could we possibly begin with Professor McEwen? I think.
Certainly, thank you. I mean, I think there ought to be a symbiotic relationship between the two. So frameworks are there because of a new relationship between the UK and the EU, and will be affected by whatever is agreed in trade negotiations. And it could be that if we see frameworks governance as an ongoing process, which I think is implied actually in the framework documents that we have seen, that could be a way for the devolved governments to feed into trade negotiations, although I noted from the Consul General's evidence to you last week that he seemed to suggest that the relationship and the negotiations around trade were more positive and more fruitful than had been the case with the internal market. But I think there is definitely a need to have a dynamic relationship between the two, because they will be, whatever is agreed in frameworks would be potentially affected by whatever is agreed in trade. And trade is a reserved competence, of course, but it's one of those areas, one of several, but one of those areas that highlights the intersection between a reserved matter and devolved matters, and that highlights again the need to institutionalize coordination and what in academic terms we talk of as systems of shared rule, and a need to sort of build in cooperation into the system.
Indeed. Would we have any comments here from Jo?
Yeah, just if we go back to the founding principles of the common frameworks, the reasons for having them, international trade, the ability to undertake international trade and create international trade agreements, that's one of the reasons that is given, or part of the context for these frameworks. It's not just the internal market. Obviously, there are close connections with it between those things. You know, there were a range of reasons given, including common shared resources and how we cope with that. So there's clearly sort of made there that explicitly, but setting in place an understanding that will be undertaken collaboratively and cooperatively. And I think what we see perhaps with the Internal Market Bill is a different way of getting us to that position of being able to enter into international trade deals without having to be concerned about policy divergence, because it can be overtaken by what's in the bill, rather than going through the common frameworks and reaching a position of having negotiations and collaborative engagement around these matters.
Thank you. Katy, would you like to have the last word or not?
Yes, just very specifically. So Northern Ireland, of course, is in a very distinct position vis-a-vis all of this, i.e., applying the Union Customs Code and yet being in the UK's customs territory. And this does relate to international agreements. For example, the common framework is meant to be non-legislative and that only relates to Northern Ireland on specified packaging and quantities of goods. This has some potential. This is potentially affected by international trade agreements, for example, with the FTA with Japan, that the UK could allow certain quantities of certain products in, which wouldn't be allowed into the EU. And hopefully in the common framework process, we could manage a way of dealing with this. But that just highlights the sort of intersection of intra-UK and then UK-EU and the complexity of all of this, just quite how much of a dynamic process it is.
Thank you very much indeed, each of you, and for your time and for your expertise and also your thoughtfulness. Generally, you've taken us into very deep and detailed